Good evening, friends. Sorry I screwed that up a second ago with the other account, or the other podcast link that I had. If you give me a moment, I'm going to be putting up a lot of the things that I've shared over the last few days as concerns Jeffrey Epstein. And we will go through kind of line by line what was really going on with Jeffrey. I tend to like these things to be a bit more conversational, a bit more involved. So, if you want to chat about it, you want to talk about what's going on. I don't really go for emotionalism. So, if you're going to do the whole, like, he was raping children thing, or you're just going to go on, like, your feelings, I'm not really interested in that. It's kind of like too late for that. It's like not really my thing. So, probably should go to another space. I'm sure that there are other people who can basically get your Epstein goodies or whatever. But yeah, what I want you to kind of think about is I want you to think about the possibility that everything you know about Jeffrey Epstein is wrong, and I want you to consider the possibility that just as there have been other elaborate hoaxes in our time, that the Jeffrey Epstein story is itself something of a hoax. And I thought we might start with Epstein's own account of what really happens back in the day and what kind of precipitated where he is now and sort of and sort of what happened to him that led to ultimately his death. And in my view, and I think the evidence supports this, so we can go into that. And by the way, if there are things that I mention, en passant or casually that are of interest to you and you want to raise your hand and ask questions about it, I'm happy to have you up. We can make a real conversation about it. I'm going to go for about maybe an hour or two, maybe a little longer. I have to go to Fort Worth because I'm being sued by this front man for Elon Musk, which is a whole separate matter. And if you like this kind of content, if this is of interest to you, I highly recommend going to my Substack. It's chuckstack.com. Charles C. Johnson Substack. You can find it. It's and become a free or paid whatever. It's cool. Like I'd love to have you. I'd love to have you involved in whatever form you're comfortable in. And if you have kind of information about Epstein, because I tend to attract people who are interested in Epstein, please feel free to send it. And I typically will answer most of my inquiries, but I don't really want to be people's pen pals. So we can maybe avoid that if that's all right with you. Um, but yeah, so what we're gonna do first is I'm a strong believer that people who are accused of things should be given a way to defend themselves, even from the grave. And I want to say just generally, a lot of the panic around Jeffrey Epstein has a lot to do with people trying to have leverage over Trump's presidency, and we will see whether or not that's going to be effective. But it's very comparable to what Netanyahu did back in the day with respect to Bill Clinton and the two-state solution. The two-state solution, by the way, that Jeffrey Epstein famously favored. He was involved with the Oslo Accords, which was about setting the framework for what became a Palestinian state. And I think actually, to my mind, Jeffrey Epstein of the last 50 years, he's probably one of the most important seminal historical figures. And at some point, my hope is that there will be some kind of book or some kind of serious undertaking here. And I've talked to a few like journalists who, are curious about kind of my dealings with Epstein. I have a meeting set up with some people from Bloomberg, another one with a very reputable journalist. Now, I should say, I first met Jeffrey Epstein uh, in 2005 when I was in high school, and I was working for Alan Dershowitz at the time. My politics have kind of differed from Dershowitz since basically since 2016, 2017 timeframe, when I supported Donald Trump, but ultimately moved into a pro-Biden, pro-Harris direction. And I would say that in terms of Israeli politics, my family has lived in Israel. My mother lived there. She went to Tel Aviv University. My grandfather worked for the CIA in Israel. My late grandfather, I should say. So I have a lot of respect for the Israelis. I am not a Zionist, though. I support a Palestinian state, and I think that ultimately, I think Israel will probably go the same way as apartheid South Africa. I don't think that Zionism is consistent with the Declaration of Independence guarantee that all men are created equal. And I think that basically, when you have this idea of a chosen race or special people, it gets very Hitlerish very quickly. And I'm not a fan of that for obvious reasons. So what we're going to do is we're going to read. I'm going to read a rather long piece that Epstein wrote, and I had a copy of it beforehand, before it kind of came out in these emails. But I confirmed that it was in fact a real kind of setup. And I see W.A. Stewart wants to come up. Yeah, if you want to join the conversation, I'm happy to have you. We're going to read the thing that Jeffrey wrote first, and then what we're going to do is we can. I have some notes here about other topics we can go into. We're going to keep it factual, and we're also going to talk maybe a little bit about Ghislaine. And so people know, I have talked to Ed Martin, who's at the Pardon Office, and I've talked to Neil McCabe, who's at the Pardon Office, and I've written letters to Ghislaine about pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell. From what I understand, there are people who are happy that she's in prison because they think that she's safe there in Bryan, Texas, and that part of the reason she's where she is because it's a bit safer for her than maybe wandering the streets at the present time. But for what it's worth, I support pardoning her, and I do not support the prosecution of her, and indeed I actually don't support the prosecution of Jeffrey. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read this because I think it's important for people who are accused to kind of get this out. And Epstein, was very conflicted about telling his own story. He spoke one time to Edward J. Epstein, who was a rather famous journalist, not no relation to Jeffrey Epstein, and he spoke to him at one point about covering his story, that is to say, Jeffrey's story. And in the memoir of Edward J. Epstein, there's a whole discussion about Epstein's relationship with the intelligence services and what was really going on there. I think it deserves a book length treatment. And I think what's interesting to me, at least, is how that hasn't really been possible. And I think partly it's because liberal Zionists and the liberal Zionist consensus, which is really present in newspapers like the Washington Post or the New York Times, they're sort of unable to really talk critically and interestingly about Epstein as a CIA asset and as basically a handler for Israelis like Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister. So anyway, without further ado, let me read this. I'm getting older. I'm having a harder time reading this. Hold on. I have up until now not told my side of the story. By the way, I sent a copy of this to Mark Epstein, who is Epstein's surviving brother, his only next of kin. Um, I I have up until now not told my side of the story. My attorneys and PR people advised me to just stay quiet, and it will all go away. I have received the same advice for 5 years now. I realize my silence is now causing collateral damage to my friends and other innocent bystanders. The time has come to let the hounds of investigative reporters loose on those that, driven by money, have made false claims, concocted malicious fabrications, and have expanded their fictions now to include others in my orbit. I was investigated for soliciting underage prostitutes. To be precise, girls under the age of 18 who were brought to my house by their close friends who worked in local massage parlors or strip clubs. West Palm Beach has scores of massage parlors and happy ending places that routinely advertise in the same local papers that have chastised my behavior. See Palm Beach Classifieds. I am and have always been a bachelor. I have used massage parlor women, licensed massage therapists, and women with no massage experience. I have never ever used force, coercion, or in fact had intercourse with any of these women. When the police investigated me, went through my garbage, searched my house, they found sex toys, but no cameras or camera equipment. Nothing, in fact, out of the ordinary from many homes of single men. There were never any photos of underage girls. Never. A careful reading of my law enforcement document makes that clear. The camera that was referred to in the search warrant was the camera installed in my house with the help of the local police to catch my houseman, John Alesi, the same houseman mentioned in many articles. He was breaking into my house and stealing money after being fired. The camera caught him in the act. These cameras were the only cameras at my house, security cameras. The local state attorneys, after conducting an extensive investigation and interviewing the girls herself, a sex crimes prosecutor with over 13 years' experience and who had herself authored the more tough legislations dealing with sex crimes, said in her own words, quote, "There are no real victims here. The girls knew they were going to a house in Palm Beach. They had their boyfriends or family members drive them to the house and wait outside, and then they encouraged their friends to go." End quote. Many of the girls interviewed were in their mid 20s, some in their early 30s, and some younger than 18. The girls that the newspapers have referred to as 14 years old told the police that she had repeatedly told me that she was 18 and a senior in high school, like many of the massage girls told me. And in her own words to the police, said the reason she was 18 was that she was told that if she didn't, Mr. Epstein would not let her into the house. The reports are available. The state attorney offered me to take a plea to aggravated assault with only probation. My attorneys told me that it would be forever a blight on my record, and I should refuse the deal. I did so. The state attorney, Barry Krisher, took the unusual step of bringing the facts before a state grand jury. In Florida, this happens more often in capital murder cases, not prostitution in someone's own home. To be certain that the public would not criticize the outcome, the state grand jury was given all the evidence and returned a verdict of solicitation and prostitution. Solicitation, a non-registrable offense which carries with it a sentence of mandatory probation. Mandatory probation, solicitation is one of the few statutes that has such a designation. The local police chief, however, met this charge with great disdain. He believed something untoward had gone on for the grand jury to return such a mild verdict after his department had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars examining the behavior of a resident that rarely left his house. Women seemed to come and go, women of all ages. Some masseuses interviewed were in their 60s, some were men. The police chief, unhappy with the decision of 12 Florida citizens that weighed the evidence, took the unprecedented step of releasing the raw police reports to the press. The raw sewage of an investigation not corroborated, or as it turns out, not even transcribed with the actual interview tapes correctly. Before a plea to the indictment was entered and the case was still open, he released the reports and then sent a letter off to the parents of some of the girls and to the FBI asking for their assistance. Only 2 days after the grand jury decided that I should only be, next page, hold on one sec. I should only be charged with solicitation of prostitution, not underage women, not pimping, but using prostitutes as a John. I received my first federal subpoena. Federal is all caps. What resulted after a 13-month investigation and can be read in my non-prosecution agreement was the federal government threatened me with a 50-page indictment alleging that I had broken federal law, though all action took place in my home in Florida. The women were from Florida and no interstate travel took place. The AUSA, which is Assistant Attorney, U.S. Attorney, said that my secretary had made telephone calls to the women. Many of those calls were return calls, and the use of the telephone by my secretary to confirm massage appointments was equivalent federally to some guy surfing the internet, knowing full well that the person on the other end of the connection is underage, and trying to coerce them into some illegal sex activity. The internet luring statute says that someone uses the phone. Oh, hold on. Says that if someone uses the let's see, hold on, I lost my place. The internet luring statute says that someone uses the means of interstate commerce, in my case it was a phone, to knowingly coerce underage persons into sex. This was the first time in history that this statute would be stretched, twisted beyond all recognition in an attempt to threaten prosecution. I had hired Ken Starr, former Solicitor General, Alan Dershowitz, law professor, Roy Black, trial attorney, Joe Whiteley, former Assistant Attorney General, and Guy Lewis, former U.S. Attorney in South Florida, to defend me against what each of them had said was no federal crime. Ken Starr wrote a brief using a federalism argument that made it clear that my crime of being a John could not be a federal crime. It was to no avail. What the federal government required was as follows. They required that my defense team, not the feds, but my team, go to the state attorney and ask that he up my charge to a pimping charge, a charge that carried with it sex registration. They would not give him the facts to support that charge or give me evidence. They said they had that I had under Florida law received money from these girls to offer them out as prostitutes. Florida law is very clear that the pimp must have a financial benefit from the crime. It would be our responsibility to ask the state attorney to up the charge and agree to sentence me to 18 months in jail and a year of house arrest. In the history of the state attorney's office, they have no other instance of someone requesting a higher charge than what the grand jury decided and a harsher penalty. In addition, the federal government would require me to pay a minimum of $50,000 to each woman on a list of women they would choose. This is an important detail, by the way, friends. Pay attention to it. A list that would be kept secret. No names on their list would be disclosed to my attorneys or myself until I was already firmly in a jail cell. A list that we would not only be required to pay money to, but if any of the women did not accept the $50,000, I would be required to pay an attorney chosen by the government to represent the women to enable them to sue me. I would have to also pay their attorney's fees. I would be given the names of the women after being in jail, would not be allowed to appeal this deal, pay women, some of whom I have never even met, and if I chose to fight this deal, I would be threatened over and over with being in breach of my own agreement. The attorney chosen by the government to represent these women hired his own daughter, a sitting state prosecutor, who received special leave to represent these women. And though she continued to receive her state salary, billed me over $800,000 in a period of one year to represent women suing me. When my side raised objections, we were told that if we fought this, the government would declare a breach of my agreement and indict me. The AUSA actually filed an affidavit with the court that stated that, quote, the protection from the government that Epstein thought he bargained for really is, quote, illusory, internal quote, is illusory, end quote, and we can always bring a case against him for the lifespan of any woman we think has been a victim. After serving my sentence, I was sued by many women on the government list. During many of the depositions taken in those cases, the women admitted to the following. They had many other clients. They got paid thousands of dollars a week to work in the local massage parlors and sex clubs. They kept their list of Johns in their Bible. Many had abusive boyfriends and abortions way before they ever met me, though they claimed sex assault abuse and various other sex claims. Most later brought their best friends to the house who also claimed the same abuse in the hopes of getting money. With what the newspapers had called a dream team, each and every lawyer, when they saw, when they saw the results of the negotiations, said with incredulity, quote, we have never seen anything like this before, end quote. I had never left my house, and the women had not traveled on my planes or to another state. I had never made money off of these women. I was a consumer of prostitution, a John. The government said they could invoke a statute for travel for the purpose of sex, which would be the equivalent to tourists who sign on to fake websites advertising sex with minors in Cambodia, Thailand, or other third world countries. The government said they could charge me with traveling to Florida to have sex with an underage girl, even though sex with 16-year-olds is legal in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and sex with 17-year-olds is legal in New York. They suggested that they would indict me for traveling to Florida, quote, full caps, for the purpose of having sex with minors. Notwithstanding the fact that I had a home in Florida for 15 years, regularly traveled to see my brother, mother, and business associates. They said that they had thought a novel application could at least get me indicted unless I took the state plea deal. I had little choice. The crimes they alleged, no matter what the likelihood of success, carried with them a minimum mandatory 10-year sentence. I recognize that I am not a sympathetic figure, and I had to decide whether to risk a trial where the jury would see an older man and young women that would be paraded in Sunday school outfits during the trial. I have shown poor judgment in the past and have paid a heavy price for those mistakes. I had hoped to move forward with my science, philanthropy, and helping those less privileged than myself. Then came Scott Rothstein. This is a very important person, by the way. This is Charles speaking. This is a very important person, Scott Rothstein, and many of you should research him. Uh, I believe that he is a Israeli spy and that he was working for the Netanyahu government. We can maybe go into like why I believe that and this sort of inner Jew on Jew crime, which is essentially what I think a lot of this is. Later, but I want you to pay careful attention to Scott Rothstein. Scott Rothstein was the senior partner of RRA. He is currently serving a 50-year prison sentence for perpetuating the largest fraud in South Florida's history. He decided that sex allegations made against me could be used to fleece hundreds of investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars. He recruited Brad Edwards, a small time Fort Lauderdale attorney who had access to some of the women on the government list. Rothstein forged judge signatures, hid behind attorney client privilege, secrecy of legal document, work product cover letter, giving illegal investigative activity the protection normally reserved for lawyers and their legitimate clients. He falsely told investors that I had settled cases with him for hundreds of millions of dollars, but the women wanted their money right away. If they gave him $30 million, he could give part of it to the women who wanted to remain anonymous. They would go off into the sunset with their money, and the full payment would be made to the investors. Investors that would be getting 50 to 100% return on their money for taking advantage of the same women who had allegedly come in contact with me. Bill Shearer, an attorney in Broward, has filed 147 complaints against Scott Rothstein and the firm. The attorney for the women, aware that I would be loath to involve innocent friends in problems that were strictly my own making, subpoenaed names and tried to smear any a friend of mine whose name appeared in print previously. They contacted Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, David Copperfield, innocent bystanders with no knowledge of any of my actions whatsoever. I settled the cases rather than forcing both the women and others to be subject to a public questioning of their lives. It appears that the Rothstein firm had continued help from the government throughout their civil litigation. Emails received as a result of recent subpoenas show descriptions such as receive info from current FBI agents, end quote. The former Rothstein partner subpoenaed my attorney for all correspondence regarding my plea with the U.S. attorney. Though highly unusual, the government sided with former Rothstein partners and agreed to produce all the correspondence between the government and my attorneys. Next page. During the civil deposition of my former houseman, Alfredo Rodriguez, attended by a new attorney from the Rothstein firm, whose name appears on the record as Cara Holmes, also appears as Caroline Holmes, also appears as Cara Holmes, spelled with a K. The houseman allegedly said that he had stolen a book from my house with telephone numbers in it that the government wanted. This was in July of 2009. I believe that the attorneys went to outside counsel, Kendall Coffee, and asked whether or not they could buy the book for the $50,000 that the houseman had asked for it. 3 months later, the FBI and the same AUSA that had headed my prosecution set up my houseman in a sting. It appears that while using a lawyer from the RRA firm, Brad Edwards, as a confidential informant for the government at the same time that Scott Rothstein was using me and the allegations against me to fleece his victims, the U.S. Attorney's Office was sitting in the Rothstein offices planning a sting operation, while next door, Scott Rothstein was making off to Morocco in an attempt to flee the country. By the way, Morocco is a non-extradition country, and of course, it's the second country to sign on to the Abraham Accords after, I think, UAE. All right. Alfredo Rodriguez was prosecuted by the same AUSA and received an 18-month sentence. However, it also appeared that on the very same day of his sting arrest, he bought an illegal gun and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Who Cara Holmes is and what her role was in RRA is still a mystery to us. She appears to be a former FBI agent out of the Chicago office. She joined the Rothstein firm in May of 2009 and joined the Florida bar at the same time. She attended depositions of my pilots and my houseman. She communicated regularly with Bradley Edwards and the investigators of my case. The email traffic is extensive. The telephone book that Alfredo Rodriguez had stolen from my home was then turned over, quote, by the government, question mark, to the same attorneys who had been told they could not buy it as they would have been buying stolen property. Brad Edwards, the former partner of Scott Rothstein, then used the Purloined book to send letters to everyone in the book asking for additional stories of my wrongdoing in the past 5 years with the hope of getting new clients. The letter was structured so as to circumvent the ethical rules regarding trolling for clients. While I was serving my sentence, my lawyers were able to come see me in jail. Only 2 months after being incarcerated, my in-house lawyer came to see me to tell me that we were now conducting an audit of legal fees paid to date. They had discovered that Gerald Lefcourt, my primary defense attorney, had taken out cash to the tune of $800,000 that, according to his own accountant, he was not entitled to. He had simply prepared invoices that said, please pay another $100,000 or $200,000. Though he had been asked on multiple occasions to substantiate his bills, his response would be, quote, we are working full time for you, end quote. I pointed that out that this was not the only firm working for me, but he replied, would you like me to quit? He eventually returned over $400,000 over a period of time, as he said that his cash flow could not handle the strain. He said that he was still owed things like taxi fare, coffee, and donuts, detailed for $2.53, and would keep $400,000. I was told that I should hire Guy Lewis, a former U.S. attorney in the Southern District. By the way, the Southern District, I think, of Florida. Lewis, a Southern-style gentleman, white suit, fast cars, said he had a great relationship with the current U.S. Attorney, Alex Acosta, and the people in Washington that would potentially need review whatever happened in South Florida. He wanted a $100,000 per month retainer, and with this, his partner, Mike Tyne, would represent me. Upon review of Lewis's background, it was suggested that he might not have the credibility that he had represented, and the rumors were that he had been asked to leave the Department of Justice for inappropriate billing. I told him in no uncertain terms that if this were true, he would need to tell me, as he was representing my credibility with the government. If he had been asked to leave the Department of Justice, it would dramatically hurt my chances if it were if hurt my chances if it were he making my case to senior officials. He swore up and down, as Southerners are apt to do, that there was no truth whatsoever to the allegations. Being charged with untrue allegations ran close to my heart, and I chose to side with Lewis. Only after my incarceration, when Lewis and Tyne came to see me in a 9 by 10 attorney room that smelled of urine, and I told them that I was now being sued by many of the girls on the government list, they expressed their regrets and their willingness to help. However, as they walked down the dungeon-like hall with the sound of clanging gates in the background, they were unaware of the security cameras and microphones throughout the hallway. They chose to high-five one another on camera and smile with the comment, this is going to be a couple more years of fees. The guards at the jail, accustomed to some of the most heinous physical crimes imaginable and hardened against most of humanity's foibles, were caught off guard by the exhilaration of the potential of more fees. Sex for money. It's a sensitive subject. The reactions range from Andrew Dworkin, the feminist who considers, I think he meant Andrea Dworkin for what it's worth, the feminist who considers all intercourse a form of rape, man inserting his authority, to Jackie Mason that posits that when a man takes a woman for dinner, many times his real motivation is the hope of receiving sex at the end of the evening. He suggests it is hypocritical for the man to be able to pay the florist for the flowers, the doorman for getting a cab, the restaurant for the food, and the liquor store for the gift of wine, but can't pay the only person that performs the actual sex without committing a crime. Yes, I paid for sex. Yes, I am a John. Yes, I understand that prostitution is a crime, and a crime that very few Johns have ever gone to jail for. I am aware that there are strong feelings amongst many people regarding that crime. Many countries have legalized it. Some states have legalized it. Many have a policy of no enforcement. New York City has escort services that openly advertise, massage parlors that have neon signs in Midtown, In actual fact, the crime of paying for sex at the time of my transgressions was under Penal Code 230, equivalent to that of jaywalking unless the girl was under 15. Yes, under the age of 15. That was New York. In Florida, the age of consent is 18. Misrepresentation of age is not considered a defense, even if the girl worked in a sex establishment where one has to prove age to work. Even if the girl was met in a bar where the drinking age is 21, or shows ID that appears to be valid that she is over 18, that is not a defense. The state attorneys who deal with this sort of crime on a regular basis reviewed the case brought by the police and said in no uncertain terms that there were, quote, no real victims, end quote, in the Epstein case. No real victims, their words. They said the women knew what they were doing. They even brought their best friends to Epstein's house after going there a number of times themselves. How could there be a serious crime? The AUSA decided that she would protect the young women of Palm Beach. She saw a need for child safety everywhere she looked. She has been chastised twice by local judges for hiding information from and misleading the court, and had a supervisor represent her in front of a judge that would have disciplined her. Her first subpoena to me asked for all my tax returns, all my medical records, my phone book, my plane logs. The women came to my house. I usually exercised every day, followed by a massage. Most of the time, I would be on the telephone when a woman was brought into the room. Many times they rubbed my feet or back. I never spoke to them at all because I would be on the telephone. The room was dimmed, and often I would not see the woman. If not on the phone, I would talk to the woman. No intercourse ever occurred. Most women testify they never touched my genitals at all. Never. Full caps. Those depositions were taken as a result of the government-supported civil trials against me. So anyway, that kind of gives you a flavor of what we're talking about here. And the reason I read it all, obviously, is because Epstein is dead, can't speak for himself. And so I think it's important and essential to really have a conversation about these topics and to really get into what was really going on here. We mentioned Scott Rothstein. I've shared some other things about that in the past. But I think what we really need to be considering as we go through this is why was there a concerted effort to quote unquote get Jeffrey? And I think it comes from all the money that he had access to. And as we see, he was a kind of fire hose or a kind of clearinghouse of all this foreign money. And I think that this approach of Epstein having all these connections, of him knowing all these rich people, that this made a lot of enemies, and they wanted to replace him. They wanted to replace him as the kind of go-between between different countries. And that is my contention of what's going on. Now, Michael Wolff, the journalist, talks about Epstein. He knew Epstein. Was friendly with him. Epstein says that they were sort of three men during the 80s in New York that were, sort of money launderers or sort of involved with nightlife in New York. And those three people were Donald Trump, Tom Barrack, and of course, Jeffrey Epstein. Now, what do I think was really going on? Well, I think when you bring, we live in a globalized economy where the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And those dollars ultimately come back into our system in some form or fashion. Usually it comes in the form of, venture capital funds, or it comes in real estate funds or private equity. There's sort of many ways in which the dollars return to us. And of course, many of us are familiar with this for our own jobs. We're familiar from many sort of different interactions we've had with global finance. It comes back, of course, in the form of tuition bills that are paid by Chinese students attending American universities. The dollars figure out a way to get back to our system. We go out, we send, our soldiers, we send our people around the world, we send our dollars around the world. The dollars come back, to us. We, of course, get, raw materials, we get plastic shit from China, and so on. And so this question of like what is an appropriate money laundering conduit by which money comes into our country has been a big issue that's been discussed a lot in recent years. There's this question of anti-money laundering, what should be the rules around it, what should be the rules around banks that engage with it. To some extent, sometimes there's an underlying crime, right, where the money is used to facilitate bad actors or bad activity. And of course, that's when the feds get involved. But sometimes the money is brought in for all kinds of things, like buying hotels, like building real estate. Certainly, Jared Kushner has been involved in this sort of thing in recent years. And of course, this question of the money flowing back into our system, the a lot of these countries that collect dollars are not democracies, right? They're sort of controlled by a ruling junta in their countries. So Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, when they send money back into the United States, they're controlling that dollar. They're controlling who gets access to it. Now, what I think typically happens is that when you get, say, $100 billion, or you get $1 billion from, say, Saudi Arabia, they send people over to watch how that money is actually spent and where it goes, and so is that's true of Russia, and so it's true of Eastern Europe. We know that Epstein was doing this kind of thing because in the emails he talks a lot about Victor Vexelberg and with a lot of people around Victor Vexelberg. And for those who are unaware, Victor Vexelberg is widely seen to be one of Russia's richest men, if not its richest. And of course, he was a backer of Gawker. Gawker, of course, is the place that published the stolen book from Epstein's house, the sort of little black book, if you will. And Gawker was a place where it was owned by Nick Denton, and of course it had this Russian backing. And Peter Thiel and I and others kind of worked to destroy Gawker over the years. And I posted some things about that. We can kind of go into that in more detail if you're curious. But ultimately, Thiel and Epstein ended up doing a number of deals together. And there's sort of a question there about Epstein as a sort of approved Russian money launderer for Putin's inner circle. And of course, he's investing in tech deals. As I mentioned before, he's an investor in 23andMe. He's friendly with Bill Gates. He's friendly with Sergey Brin. There's sort of all of that going on in the backdrop. Now, I see David's here. David, is there anything you want to add? Any questions you have? I'm going to pull up the rest of my notes.
Chuck, thank you for taking the time for reading that into the record, if you will. I read that document like a day ago, whenever you posted it, and it was the first time that I thought, maybe there's something more to this whole thing. There's got to be like a whole other story of what was like really going on. And so, if this is all genuine from these new document leaks, that's crazy. And it's also especially interesting to look at some of the connections that have been coming out about Epstein's close connections with Bitcoin startup people. I know like Bitcoin Core, I think, received funding from Epstein and some of the other developers. There was an email even saying that Epstein was hosting a party that both Satoshi and like Peter Thiel would be at. So I was kind of curious if you knew anything about that angle of it, about the kind of cryptocurrency angle, because I know Whitney Webb has covered some of it, Mark Goodwin has covered some of it, about Tether and stable coins and the CBDC stuff. I was curious
Yeah, I mean, I think
what your thought was, because like everybody only ever talks about the child sex trafficking, nobody ever talks about the financial stuff that he was doing. So if he was building some sort of crypto thing, that seems interesting and relevant to know about, considering all the legislation that Trump is passing.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, people know that I was an early Bitcoiner. I was heavily involved in it at one point in my life. Haven't been involved with it for a few years now. And yeah, so you got to think about like who would have created a Bitcoin? Like, what is Bitcoin? And I've said elsewhere that my contention is that Satoshi is actually the NSA, or actually the U.S. government. Probably the Office of Comptroller of the Currency would be my guess, and that it's a kind of way in which it's a kind of Ponzi scheme set up by the government to make a lot of transactions much more traceable. And so the cryptocurrency thing, in my view, is a way in which the government can track the dollar in all kinds of places that it wouldn't otherwise be able to track. So you think about, if you're producing physical cash, right? Most money now is digital, but if you're producing physical cash, about like a rollerboard that you bring on your your carry-on luggage on a plane. If that's filled with stacks of 10,000, basically of $10,000, you can fit about $1 million into one of those. So you can imagine a world in which you're wanting to move large quantities of cash across the country or across a border or something. And so that's a real problem if you're trying to move money quickly. And so cryptocurrency presents an opportunity to do that, to move money sort of anonymously, to move it in a thumb drive or a brain wallet or any number of other ways in which you can move the money. And my contention is that a lot of the U.S. debt has gone into basically, we go and we buy all this stuff from China. China gets our dollars, and then they in turn can't bring a lot of money out of China. I think they're barred for over $50,000 or something like that. Their capital controls in China sort of have to put them in the bank. The banks are very controlled by the government in China. And so what people were doing was they were trying to figure out ways to buy Bitcoin, with yuan. And so this was a kind of interesting question about moving money across borders. So my contention is that Jeffrey and others, while he might have been interested in it from a purely like ideological basis, I think it was also interesting from a financial basis or for an intelligence basis. And so having all these people together, going to events in which all the Bitcoin people would show up, that was sort of a kind of useful thing for him to do. I don't think he really took seriously any of the BRICS stuff. There's some emails where he's talking about some of that, but it was kind of dismissed later on. So yeah, I think
Yeah, that
yeah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's like it's pretty interesting, because I've heard that, Tether has been very cooperative working with like federal authorities and stuff like that when it comes to money laundering and tracing where all the coins go. And with this USAID stuff, right? I remember hearing stories about how they were unable to trace where any of the money went out of like particular offices, either at USAID or wherever else. This was like early on in
Yeah, it used to
Trump 2
be.
2.0.
I mean, it used to be back in the day in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, the U.S. government would actually show up with physical sacks of cash and hand those
Mhm.
sacks of cash to people. And obviously, a lot of that money ended up getting washed or put into Swiss bank accounts or UAE bank accounts or being used for all kinds of illegal activity. So yeah, it was a very kind of interesting thing. My contention, for what it's worth, is that a lot of the money laundering that takes place in the world is usually in places that have sort of failed governments, and so lots of countries around the world would love to use the U.S. dollar as a substitute because it keeps a lot of its value. And so you look at like major transactions, a lot of it takes place in dollars or euros around the world, even when that's not the currency in question. And so, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Now, of course, when money comes back into the U.S. system, it shapes our own society in all these ways, right? Because, like, if Jared Kushner is getting $1 billion from the Saudis, he's going to use it for projects he thinks should exist. He's going to use it for apartment complexes or buildings or hotels or what have you. He's not necessarily going to use that money for building more housing, say, or for investing in technologies that the rest of us would like to see exist in the world. So that's kind of how one should think about it. There's sort of this question about when the dollars come back into our system, how can those dollars be used that actually benefit the American people? And that, I think, is sort of the missing piece of the Trump administration, and it's something that really needs to be addressed probably in another presidential administration.
Now, something else I wanted to ask you about, I can't remember if I saw that you tweeted this earlier, but basically what you were suggesting is, as you have been for a while, that Jeffrey Epstein is CIA and that he was involved in a kind of operation going after the oligarchs, going after, the Clintons, Bill Gates, and, taking their oligarchical wealth and transforming that into a foundation, obviously with like governance and a board of directors. I guess, could you expand on that thesis of what it was that Epstein was doing, and for whom.
Yeah, I think this is an important detail, and I think it's something that people have a lot of hard time kind of really understanding. Which is that, if you think about like how somebody becomes a billionaire, Teal famously said this. He said this to me. I think he said it to others. But what he used to say is, he said, if you want to be a billionaire, you have to get in between two countries that are trading with each other, and then take a cut or take a toll of the money going back and forward. And in our own time, we've seen that people become like famously rich and successful, kind of doing this trade. So, for Elon Musk, the trade is taking the resources from Africa, which get turned into batteries in China, rare earth batteries in China, which then get turned into Teslas and sold on the American market. So he's sort of like, that's the sort of flow of capital of resources around Elon. In the case of a lot of the financial stuff, you can think of like PayPal was about moving money from China and from Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, and moving money, moving people, moving information. That's kind of globalization, kind of writ large. So, what I would say about this, just kind of generally, like as we're thinking about our foundations, is that historically, when we've had people that have gotten really, really wealthy, that have built huge empires, business empires in our society, what we tend to do is we tend to turn them into foundations. We tend to make it so that, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, that basically they sort of, the families kind of quote unquote win capitalism, and their wealth, is sort of taken by boards, which are, usually men and women of eminence in the society, and that those boards are then used to do charitable things, to do good things in the world. Now, you can imagine a foundation being captured, right, where you actually, you're Bill Gates and you've turned everything into a foundation, but what you do is, you're hiding money, or you're moving money in a slush fund. You're using it to pay out all these people. And you see a lot of the time with a lot of these charities that they're actually tax dodges of wealthy families. There are ways in which they can minimize paying taxes. And so that is my contention, which is that a lot of very wealthy people do that these days. And that what we need is, we need some kind of leader that basically says, you oligarchs of the world, you're going to need to become foundations. And we've seen this before. I mean, FDR did this. His cousin Teddy Roosevelt did this kind of trust busting. And I think we're going to start to see more of this as time goes on in the United States, where we're going to say, all right, Elon, you get like, a few $100 million, but like no more weird sex parties, no more like having, dozens of baby mamas. We sort of limit the way in which these oligarchs can actually affect the rest of us. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on. Now, in the case of Epstein, sort of have to contend yourself with several things. So he's meeting with Panetta, the former CIA director, and he's meeting with Bill Barr, who of course becomes the future CIA director. And he's meeting with him. They're chatting back and forth in the emails. By the way, you're free to search the emails. If you just search, if you go online and search Jeffrey Epstein searchable emails, you'll find it. You can check your own, your own questions there. And so, yeah, I mean, there's some interesting details here that I think people really need to be thinking about and really kind of engaging with in a serious way. I am a big fan of this effort of reducing billionaires and of basically making them work for the interests of the U.S. Public. And I think that we should try to have more philanthropic, wealthy people. If you think about things like, in the case of Carnegie, Carnegie basically built a lot of the modern, the sort of what became the Carnegie Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment. A lot of that money was used to basically build all these rural libraries, where he would put up half the money and the local town would put up the other half. And what I've always found interesting is, supposedly we're in this era of like great wealth, right? Mark Andreessen calls it like, this is a time of like the second Medici period, reference to like the Renaissance. People talk about a golden age. And yet, you look around in our country, and a lot of the institutions that should be functioning, that have been, funded in the past by very wealthy people, they're sort of not being funded this time around. And in my own case, like, I stopped Elon Musk from giving $230 billion to this guy named Igor Kurganov, who was a kind of corrupt poker player. And Musk in turn backed some people suing me, and so to kind of punish me for trying to stop that from happening. So we have this sort of question here of the effective altruists who are really fronts of foreign governments or foreign players. And so we have a lot of work we have to do in kind of understanding how these capital flows work and how they can actually be used for the benefit of all Americans and of our interests generally. And in the case of Doge, where we basically took in a lot of these billionaires, surprise, surprise, Musk cut a lot of the government agencies that were actually investigating and regulating what he was up to. So he targeted people at the Department of Transportation, he targeted people at the EPA, and so on. So we have this issue of the oligarchs trying to shape our government so that they can in turn be richer and richer and then use the money from that to influence our politics. Over the next coming days, I'll be putting some stuff out about all the weird Musk activity in Pennsylvania, and I posted some of that for those who want to join my private Signal group. Message me some details about who you really are, and I'll be happy to include you in it. But we've been sort of like researching some of that as time has gone on. So you can think about Musk spent $250 million on the presidential campaign, and he was telling people that had the outcome been another way, he might have gone to jail. And I think we need to sort of think more seriously, even like liberal billionaires, people like Reid Hoffman, who was kind of leading a campaign attacking Lena Khan, who is the head of the FTC, and now now that the sort of co-chair of Zoran Momdani's his sort of transition. He was sort of smearing her, targeting her because she was restricting a lot of these illegal mergers that were going on. So we're going to see, I think, over time that we have a sort of fight against the oligarchy, and that a lot of our politics kind of rests from there. Now, there are people that benefit from the oligarchy, namely a lot of foreigners who can then use these compromised billionaires to fund their own spying activity and their own illegal activity in the United States. And I think this explains why you see, Netanyahu sitting with Musk at things like, in the House of Representatives, or why you see you know, Netanyahu cozying up to these various oligarchic Americans, some of whom are Jews, some of whom are not. But that's sort of where we kind of see that. And if you think about a billionaire, a billionaire has $1,000 million, right? So you could take $250,000 and make somebody's life, and you could use that and fund all kinds of things off book. And I think that's kind of where we are with a lot of quote unquote charitable giving and a lot of political spends that take place. So we've got Adam, we've got Nave, we've got Stevenson. Do you guys have anything you want to add or any questions you want to ask?
Yeah, so what do you think is like if you look at Epstein and his involvement with the CIA, where does that start? Like, what is the timeline within sort of Epstein's biography? When he gets his money and then he has the initial legal problems, and then where does that start? When is he turned, so to speak, by
I
the
think it
CIA?
happens after he fires Dershowitz from representing him. So I think what happens is there's a pressure campaign. He doesn't get into this in his letter, but there was a pressure campaign by that AUSA to basically investigate him for money laundering and to basically open up this huge investigation. And we see this from Jason Leopold's and the Bloomberg team's investigation. And so what they were doing is they continued to investigate him to kind of force him into a situation where he essentially took a plea deal. And I think when he took that plea deal, when he switched out a lot of his attorneys, fired Dershowitz et al., he switched out all the people who were kind of screwing him. I think that's when he became a Fed, basically. And
So wait, so what do you think about the connections with Maxwell, Inslaw, the Promise software scandal of like the mid 1980s, the Iran Contra networks?
I think that
I mean, because doesn't this fit into all of
yeah,
that?
so those are certainly a part of that. So there was this whole thing called the Safari Club, For those who are unfamiliar, if you just Google Safari Club private CIA, in the 1970s, there was all these investigations about CIA malfeasance and misbehavior, and there was a kind of private CIA that was created called the Safari Club, and many of its members, including Adnan Khashoggi, if depending on who you believe, Donald Trump, and many of the kind of leaders of Saudi Arabia and of East Africa and of parts of Israel and the U.S. military, particularly people like John Towers, who was a senator. That whole network was very involved in sort of carrying out and doing activities, and they were kind of like probably like what we might consider like a kind of private deep state, and there's kind of vestiges of it that are still around today. But really post 9/11, the US government really took hold of a lot of this, and sort of directed a lot of it as well. And of course, as time goes on, we pass more anti-money laundering laws. There's sort of more investigations there. Now Trump has shut down a lot of that kleptocracy project, the Trump administration has, which uh, remains to be seen if that was a good idea or not. But this question of like, how do you isolate a Russia, right? How do you isolate some of these countries? Well, you cut off their access to the U.S. dollar through the sanctions, and then also when they get the dollars, you make it so that it's very hard for them to spend those dollars back in the United States, and this, of course, impoverishes them. This is the theory, anyway. It impoverishes them and makes it harder for them to be, part of the global community. Now, of course, the opposite side of that argument is that it also leads to autarky, and if their country like Russia could really actually survive for a very long time, not necessarily relying on a whole bunch of others. So it's not necessarily the most effective of policies. But yeah, so when it comes to promise and it comes to Robert Maxwell, I published some things before. If you go to Chuck Stack, you could look it up. But I wrote about Robert Maxwell's FBI file, and it's my contention that Robert Maxwell what was a kind of agent of the Soviets, but and the Israelis, and to some extent the British. They used to call him the bouncing Czech, sort of as a joke. But he was a Jew from basically Eastern Europe, from Czechoslovakia, what was then Czechoslovakia, and he married a French Huguenot woman and had a number of children with her. One of them, the youngest of whom, was Ghislaine. And Ghislaine was, private school educated, grew up speaking French, as a lot of the Maxwell kids did, and they were sort of, it was a sort of austere upbringing by their father, and he, owned a number of publications around the world. In particular, he owned a lot of press in the UK. He was at one point a member of Parliament, even as a member of the Labour Party, and he was very Zionistic, a sort of liberal Zionist, if you will. And when the Soviet Union fell, there was a sort of shortfall in the pensions that he was raiding of one of his newspapers, and of course those pensions ended up getting bailed out by the British government. And in so doing, that's what led to a young Scott Bessent working for then George Soros in London, betting strongly against the British pound, which is a kind of interesting detail here. What I see is that Epstein more or less took Maxwell under his wing as a kind of act of somewhat of charity, but also as a kind of business arrangement, where she could give him, a Jew from New York, access to basically this other world of, basically the royals, all the kind of like wealthy people of Europe. She was very sophisticated in a way that he, who had never, gone to college, not really anyway, he'd never really finished college, that he couldn't really get access to. And so it was like a kind of alliance there. Um, they were friendly. We know this from the emails, but the promise stuff, I think, is overdetermined in a lot of this, where people talk about the promise stuff. What Maxwell specialized in was trying to find advantages. So what he would do, the elder Maxwell, what he would do is he would take the money that he had, some of which he'd stolen, and he would transfer resources backwards and forwards from the Soviet Union to the United States, less so to the United States, more to the UK. And Maxwell at one point was about to open up operations. He was about to try to buy the New York Daily News in New York, when he was, when
He owned the Daily Mirror and MirrorSoft software, like
that's right.
Tetris.
Yeah. Well, of course, Tetris was built, as people know, Tetris was built in Russia, sort of a Russian product. But what he was doing basically was a kind of arbitrage across the Iron Curtain. That was kind of his play. And then, of course, he would make money from the rents from that, the profits from that, and then send some of it back to Israel or some of it to finance, investigations, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, very very kind of interesting man. Um, he's a sort of fascinating figure in his own right. Now, what I do find interesting, um, you know, what I do find interesting about the Epstein story is how many people have a kind of emotional reaction to it. Because obviously there's lots of pervy Jewish guys. There's lots of pervy people in South Florida. I'm sure Adam could regale us with stories of all the crazy stuff he's seen in Florida. And so there's this sort of larger question here of like what's going on here. Now, I think from the emails we can see rather clearly that Epstein was bossing around Ehud Barak, that they were business partners, they were aligned in all these ways. And Ehud Barak is a former, counterintelligence person. He's a former Israeli prime minister. He's one of Israel's highest ranking military people. And yet here he is taking orders from, Coney Island's Jewish young kid from Coney Island. Like what gives? And I think what the answer was that he was basically what we might consider Ehud Barak's handler, and that a lot of the money that was given to Epstein or managed by Epstein over the years was kind of used by the U.S. government, and Epstein would keep people apprised of what was going on. So you can see this with all the Obama officials he's talking to. He seems to have friends in every nook of life, right? He's got literary friends. He's got Harvard professors, MIT professors. He's talking to Woody Allen. I mean, he's really like ranging the gamut, in terms of his access to people. And those are just the ones that we kind of know about. I mean, obviously, there's a whole bunch that we don't know about, or we have kind of only the smallest of pictures, right? I mean, he's friendly with the guy who runs the Djibouti ports. Weird, but he is. There's photos with him, with the Pope. There's photos with him with the Queen. So he's pretty much everywhere at once. Now that he's died, though, and his name has such a low approval ratings, as it were, and people can run their own playbooks, he becomes a kind of useful figure for the U.S. intelligence community because he can be used to do all kinds of things, like say go after the monarchy, right? And so I think that that's a kind of interesting angle as well. But my big kind of view of him is that part of the reasons I suspect he's U.S. intelligence is that there really hasn't been a decisive book that's been written about him by a mainstream American publisher. So we're going on 6 years since he died, and there's no like major tome by a respectable, responsible journalist. People point to Julie Brown, but Julie Brown's own stories show that she doesn't really have that reputation for being always having an integrity and always being accurate. And of course, the Miami Herald is not the New York Times. It's not the Washington Post. It's not the Wall Street Journal. It's not one of these, Mother Jones properties or any of these kind of like outlets that produce kind of decent but lefty reporters like New Yorker or what have you. And of course, it's owned by, I think at the time it was owned by the Knight Foundation, which is in and of itself a kind of like right wing Zionisty kind of thing. So the question, of course, is what gives with the targeting of Epstein. Well, I think partly it's a sexual moray question where things have changed. And I'm certainly not defending the kind of model culture of the 80s and 90s. I would say that it was a different time. I mean, not everybody had iPhones, there were not cameras everywhere. It was a sort of different world in a lot of ways. Not excusing it, but it was kind of different. And you can get a sense of this if you watch like old movies from that time, if you read, publications or tabloids. The culture was just different. It wasn't as we have today. And I think in the main, I think the culture has improved in a lot of ways, but there's a kind of like primal panic that people have used by associating the name Epstein and say child trafficking, right? And that's kind of designed to shut down a conversation. And you may want to use that to actually shut down a conversation around Epstein so that nobody actually talks about the money or all the associations or what he was doing investing in this technology company or that technology company. So that's kind of my just general sense of it. I have a few other remarks. People are talking a lot about this the situation with Plaskett, who's the U.S. She's the delegate. There are no congressmen from the U.S. Virgin Islands. She is from the U.S. Virgin Islands, where Epstein made his home, or made one of his homes, and she was actually leading the second impeachment. She and Raskin were leading it. The first impeachment, of course, was led by Adam Schiff, and of course, he made a pig's breakfast of it. We all are kind of familiar with that. But Plaskett was running the second. Now, if you look her up, she has all these connections with House Intelligence. She has all these connections with the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, which of course is the CIA, training place. And it would stand to reason that she would be very useful to Epstein, and Epstein would be very useful to her, insofar as they're interviewing Michael Cohen, and Cohen, of course, was shaking down all these companies and going to go work, going to get them to basically pay him because of his fondness and closeness to Donald Trump, and in particular, there was this issue around the Renova Group, and Renova Group got sanctioned in the Russia, collusion probe. But Renova Group was, as I mentioned before, Viktor Vekselberg's money. Viktor Vekselberg, of course, being one of Russia's richest men, and of course, the source of a lot of the capital that was going into deals that Ehud Barak and Jeffrey Epstein were doing. So I think that kind of thing where Epstein is kind of helping investigators, I think that might have been actually what ultimately led to his downfall. My suspicion is that he was lured to the United States. He was in France at the time. So July 6th, he flies back. He's arrested. He's arrested by basically U.S. Attorney Jeff Berman. And Berman is a kind of interesting figure, a kind of Zionist, kind of Jewish guy. Ultimately, is fired in the first Trump presidency. There's a lot of sort of Israeli IDF compromise of the Southern District of New York, and Berman is fired. And then, confusingly, there's another judge, a Judge Berman, who, of course, is also involved here. And of course, he's been sort of kind of forgotten in a lot of this, but he was sort of supposed to let Epstein out, and there was every indication that he would have let Epstein out. This sort of Judge Richard Berman. Now, Judge Richard Berman is interesting because he was sort of put into his position by a young Chuck Schumer, and so that's a kind of interesting detail here as well. Named, of course, by Bill Clinton, but he got his start from Giuliani and sort of earlier on in his career. And again, another very Zionisty judge. And of course, he took over the case. Um, and he took over the case, right afterwards. Now, I would say this idea that Epstein attempted suicide, I think, has a lot of problems with it. And we know that there was, well, let me read this to you so you get a sense of it. And we can kind of go into more detail on this a little later if you're curious about it. But this comes from the book, a book called called Assume Nothing. And it's probably one of my favorite books. I highly recommend it to people who are interested in this topic. It's written by a man I knew back when he was alive. Um, let's see here. Hold up. Give me a second. Oh, hold up. It's in my Kindle account, not my book account. Hold up. Yeah. So, Edward J. Epstein, kind of came to fame. He was a kind of a scribe for James Jesus Angleton, and James Jesus Angleton, of course, was the kind of head of counterintelligence for CIA. And so that was sort of, Edward J. Epstein wrote a book about Snowden that showed that there was a lot of problems with the story that Snowden was telling, that he was very possibly a Russian spy. And so Edward was a very brilliant writer in his own right. But what's interesting to me about him is that you have to read him very, very carefully because he leaves a lot of interesting details that are well, they're quite disturbing in a lot of ways because they raise a lot of questions about how our government really operates. Now, this is the key detail. So this is from his book. It's on page 354 of Assume Nothing. And, Edward J. Epstein is going through, all the stuff around, around the death of Epstein on August 11th, 2019. And mind you, we've never seen photos of Epstein's body. There are rumors out there that he was garroted. I haven't seen any photos of it. His brother hasn't seen any photos of it. Quite curious stuff. All right, so this is the section. Martin Weinberg and other of Epstein's defense attorneys expressed to me doubts about this finding. Oh, hold up. This is so Epstein was found dead on the floor of a jail cell at the MCC on 6:30 a.m. on August 11, 2019. How did he die in a locked cell just 15 feet away from two guards? Barbara Sampson, the chief medical examiner in New York City, determined the cause of death was suicide by hanging, a finding she said was based on a careful review of investigative information. The presumed motive was that he could not face remaining in prison. Martin Weinberg and other of Epstein's defense attorneys expressed to me doubts about this finding. Unlike the coroner, they had direct knowledge of Epstein's state of mind less than 8 hours prior to his death since they had met with him in the MCC. That's I think it's the Metropolitan Correctional Center, something like that. Telling Epstein that they were about to file an appeal for bail with additional security measures designed to meet the judge's stated concerns. In addition, Weinberg told him there was a high level Department of Justice witness who had agreed to swear that the prosecutors in Florida had illicitly transferred material from Epstein to prosecutors in New York, an error that provided grounds for Epstein's indictment to be quashed. Since when they left Epstein, since when they left Epstein seemed buoyed over these developments and expressed hope about being released on bail, his lawyers could not see any clear motive for him killing himself a few hours later. In any case, his sudden demise added to the mystery of the source of Epstein's wealth. According to the court filings released after his death, he had $570,672,654 in cash, bank deposits, and property. This meant that in the 30 years since I had first met him, he had gone from being a small time grifter who faked airplane upgrades and bounced checks to a tycoon who had amassed over a $500 million fortune, even after he paid out tens of millions of dollars to settle victims by his quote unquote Jane Doe victims, as was required by his plea agreement and vast legal fees. He had given over $100 million to scientific research at Harvard, MIT, and other universities. And he told me he was working with he told me in 2013 that he was working with Bill Gates to create a multi-trillion-dollar philanthropic fund, a claim that I did not believe. Yet the New York Times partly confirmed, reported after his death, that Epstein had told Gates that he had access to trillions of dollars of his clients' money that he could put in the proposed charitable fund. So, um, very interesting stuff, very, very fascinating stuff. And I think we're never really going to know the full story of what happens, but I think we need to be pushing for it as time goes on. Um, does anyone else have anything they want to add? I want to see if I have any other notes that I left. There are probably a few other things, and I was maybe thinking of doing this kind of more seriously. We can go into the Israel side of it if people want. I don't want to be seen to have any evasion there. You know,
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna. Yeah, I was gonna ask you about. I was thinking about the Julie K. Brown thing. That she said she started. She like restarted this whole thing around 2018 because of the Me Too thing. That was like her story, right? That's why she decided
Yeah,
to
I mean,
kind
look,
of pick it back
so
up.
Brown is interesting to me for a lot of reasons, right? So first of all, there's this sort of pedigree question around her. So, she's 63 years old, I think 63, 64, something like that. She comes out of Philly, so she's not unlike you, Adam, where she comes from, Pennsylvania, goes down to Florida. And she's so she's working for the Philadelphia News. She graduates magna cum laude from Temple University, which is a kind of Zio-friendly, university there, that's had all these issues over the years at Temple, some of which we can get into if people are curious. But
Lex
Lex
Friedman
Friedman
fame,
comes out of
right?
there. There's quite a number of
Yeah.
people that have come out. There's a lot of scandals there that have been degree farming and all of that. Basically a degree mill and all that kind of thing. And she, of course, worked her way up, which is commendable. It's impressive in different ways. But what I find interesting about it is, Jeff Berman, who we mentioned earlier. So this is what he says. Jeff Berman says that he had been, quote, assisted by some excellent investigative journalism. And quote, and then she says the real heroes here were the courageous victims that faced their fears and told their stories. Well, I don't want to be kind of petty Anna about this, or sort of like difficult on this, but there was never really a trial, so we can't really say definitively that these people were victims. And I think that's where it gets kind of challenging: is what does it mean to be a victim or a survivor? And maybe there's of course a moral sense in which somebody's a victim, but of course we have courts in our system, and courts are not necessarily designed to provide justice, but they're designed to stop injustice, really. And so there's this sort of question here of Brown was sort of collecting all these people, and she was sort of collecting all these people, to come and basically work with her. And what I find interesting about it, about the Brown stuff, is that the Miami Herald, you know, this is not the most honest of publications, to put it mildly. It's had histories over the years, scandals over the years, in how it's covered things. But what I find, and we can maybe go into some of that, about the Knight Foundation, all the kind of stuff that's around that. And I'd probably have to go back and look at some of my notes on this, but basically, what seems to me what was going on was not only was it the Me Too thing that was sort of pushing it, but of course it was also the Israeli elections. And people have commented on this elsewhere, but Yair Netanyahu, who is the sort of one of the sons of the gay son of Prime Minister Netanyahu, they were making a big deal about Epstein's relationship with Ehud Barak, because Ehud Barak was entering the second Israeli elections in 2019. And there was a sort of concern that, just as in the 1990s, when Netanyahu was thrown out of government then, that there would be a similar effort taking place. And of course, the more you can jam up the various liberal Zionists, the sort of anti-Netanyahu but liberal Zionists, the more you can jam up those wealthy American Jews, the more you can send a signal to the rest of the Jews to get on board, to basically be, the helpers of Netanyahu's government. And I think something like 90% of the money that the Likud party gets comes from outside of the state of Israel, which is a tremendous amount of capital, for anybody, tremendous amount of money. But yeah, so the Julie K. Brown thing, Michael Tracy has done kind of more work, kind of exposing her, kind of journalistic malpractices that she's engaged in. And so I wouldn't necessarily, want to go into as much detail as he has. If people are curious, they can kind of go at that. But for me,
Yeah, I listened to some of that stuff because she's basically still working with Bradley Edwards, if I'm remembering this right.
that's right,
I
and,
might
and
I might be getting things confused.
that's right, and she and he are sort of like, their careers are kind of tied together, right? So she has invested considerable effort and energy to basically create this idea of Epstein as a monster. And I'm not necessarily countenancing people like paying for sex, though I think that happens all the time in our society, and I think it's happening kind of more and more, for all kinds of different reasons around it. Um, and
I
so,
mean, it is sort of funny to be like a writer for the Miami Herald and make a huge deal about people paying for sex.
yeah, I mean, my
Like that's
understanding.
not just like daily life here.
My understanding is that in Florida, the South Florida, the distinction between girlfriend and prostitute and sugar baby and all of that is quite there. It's quite, shall we say, vague, right? It's blurred lines to be sure.
Yeah, it has been interesting like the last 10 years or so because I do think like a lot of that stuff that I thought like I just knew about like yeah, girls having a sugar daddy and like a sponsor and all that stuff. All that stuff has really gone national because of Instagram, but yeah, like all of that is normal day-to-day stuff here. It has been for a while. It is just kind of interesting that it has spread so far.
Yeah, and in a way, that's a kind of part of overall inequality too, right? I mean, people aren't getting paid the wages that they used to support themselves, right? But I suppose it's the oldest profession, right? Politics and prostitution, they're sort of linked in all these ways. But what I
Yeah,
find
I guess I
interesting
was
about
just
it,
thinking with the Julia K. Brown thing, like because you mentioned once with Epstein that basically I'm paraphrasing and I might get this wrong, but basically you kind of said that he was sort of keeping Israel like under wraps, as in like they weren't behaving that badly while he was around, and that once he got taken out, they kind of like the cuffs were taken off. So it's kind of
yeah,
interesting that
I think that's basically right. So I think that there were a number of Jews and Jewish oligarchs in the United States, American Jewish oligarchs, that kind of controlled Israeli politics because they could control who would get, say, a grant from the Wexner Foundation and who would not. And I think that when Epstein died, there was a lot of people that are like, "Holy shit, this guy has the ability to use his allies in the media and his allies in the U.S. attorney's offices to indict people and put them in jail. And while they're in jail, they get killed, right? Which is it's pretty shocking. It's pretty incredible in all those ways. Um, and I pointed this out before, but Virginia Guffreys has a lot of a lot of issues, right? There's a lot of things. That are not true, right, about her. And my friend, for those who don't know her work, it's Deanna Calderon. I've sort of shared some of her stuff up top. Um, she and I have done some of the research here, but yeah, um, so 6 months after Virginia Roberts leaves her Russian mafia trafficker Ron Eppinger, she goes to live with her dad at Mar-a-Lago. Now, Guffrey's, there's a lot of like psychological things with her. There's a lot of examples of things that she's made up over the years. Obviously she took her own life. That's quite sad. I think all the files around her should be released, of course. But there's a kind of question here about Scott Rothstein, about the Israeli mob, about organized crime in Florida, the sort of different factions fighting with each other. And it's interesting too, like, to think about this sort of question of Bradley Edwards being an FBI informant. And we've seen recently that there's been a lot of problems with FBI informants. And for those who don't know, I was an FBI informant for some time. And I experienced similar things where there were a lot of problems with the FBI and how it manages that informants, and how oftentimes some informants can be foreign governments that get busted or whatever, and then feed fake information into our system. So obviously, we need to be very careful with how we use informants, particularly when those informants lead to a loss of liberty of somebody, or even potentially losing their life. So yeah, the kind of key detail. So Ron Eppinger is was a kind of kind of bad actor. Um, and he was the one who was trafficking and kind of dealing with Virginia Guffreys ahead of time. And I'll put this up in the chat so people can see it. But there's other issues too here that we have to get into, which is that the corruption of the local Palm Beach police. And I believe some of the investigators around it went to go work for like booze distributorships after they left. One left the country to go work in Russia doing enemy broadcasts for Putin. I kid you not. I forget the guy's name. Somebody might be able to find it and put it up. But if you Google like Palm Beach, Russia broadcast, maybe you'll find it. There was a New York Times article about it. And so yeah, I mean, I think there's this like question here around the hoaxing of people and the sort of emotionalism around the whole Epstein case. And of course, you have this detail of Mike Cernovich was trying to unseal a lot of the records around Epstein, the sort of question around Epstein and the Clintons. And so this idea that you could use a convicted sex trafficker or a convicted, pedo or whatever, however your frame is, and use a mere association with him to smear your opponents. And given that he was sort of friendly with everybody and knew everyone for a time and place, you could basically hit anything. You could hit the royalty, you could hit the Pope, you could hit anything in business. So I've always found that kind of curious, that whole story and how it all works. And I think as time goes on, more and more people will start to ask questions about, was this whole thing a kind of smear job, designed to achieve an objective? And the objective, I think, was to move Epstein out of position so that all of the money that would typically flow from Russia or elsewhere, from Saudi into the United States, that it would go through Israeli hands, and or maybe through Jared Kushner's hands, for that matter.
What's the Mormon angle here? Because, I mean,
I'm so
Geoffrey
happy
is
with that.
Mormon, and is Bradley Edwards, is he not Mormon as well?
I have been told that Edwards is Mormon. I don't know that definitively. I do know that there's lots of FBI agents who are involved in this case that have like weird Mormon ties. And for those who are unaware, Florida's largest landowner after the federal government, of course, is the Mormon Church. It's like the Mormon Church, then Disneyland, okay, or Disney World, excuse me. And so, yeah, so this question about money moving from Russia into the United States, historically, a lot of it moved through John Huntsman and through the Huntsman Network. And I've written about John Huntsman and the Mormons and how he became an Armenian citizen, a white guy from Idaho who ultimately settles in Utah, is moving money, moving oil money out of Russia. And that whole process of oil and sort of taking resources from Russia, turning it into dollars, and extracting that wealth. That's been sort of the story of Russia, sort of basically since the fall of communism, and maybe even kind of during the period of communism. With Armand Hammer and some other figures. The Koch brothers, famously libertarian big figures. Their family was involved in building oil refinery technology for the communist Russians and the fascist Germans. So, so yeah, I mean, the Mormon angle here is interesting. Obviously, the FBI is chock a block with Mormons, and my contention is that Guffrey's, was raised Mormon. There's this kind of Mormon sexual panic. They're kind of different than the rest of us for different reasons, obviously. We can maybe kind of go into some of that at some point if people are kind of curious. But my contention is that there's always these kind of Mormon Jewish alliances, Mormon Israeli connections. And a lot of this has to do with like who gets access to the money that flows from one place to the other. Um, and I think what we're going to see as time goes on, and there's the Teal aspect of this too, where Epstein puts money from that's really Vexelberg's money, which really is probably Putin's money. So he does a deal with Putin's guy and with Teal into this thing called Valor Ventures, and Valor Ventures is of course one of the main partners there is Mormon. And so there's a lot of Mormon activity around Teal and has been historically. Teal's right hand guy for many years is this guy, Jeff Casilla, who's Mormon. And so there's a kind of Mormon angle around a lot of money moving in this country and around a lot of these, kind of billionaire types. And it kind of stands to reason why that would be. Mormons are very organized, they're very good at getting things done. Of course, Musk's right hand man is Mormon, right? Jared Burchell. And of course, there's a tradition of this going all the way back to Howard Hughes, right? Where the Mormons would sort of take care of Howard's kind of excesses, Hughes's excesses. So yeah, this Guffrey's question around Mormons and moving money, money laundering, just generally, it's all sort of a piece there. Any other comments or any other thoughts? I see Livid has done very good work. Livid's Revenge. So I'm happy to see her stuff that she's sending me, and I'll share some of that up in the Jumbotron, Livid, that you sent me. But yeah, it's kind of curious what was going on there. Uh, Yeah, and of course, once you nailed Epstein as a sort of sex trafficker, everybody had to give up their money and donate it to certain people. That was sort of interesting as well, sort of what was going on there. And, it was interesting. I worked on the Epstein case, as I mentioned, back when I worked for Alan Dershowitz in high school. And it was fascinating. It's fascinating to see something that I worked on get kind of twisted and contorted in all these elaborate ways. And it's also been fascinating, like it's now being used to sue other major financial institutions like JP Morgan. And, there's this question here of like, why was JP Morgan allowed to do a number of acquisitions it's done lately? I think there was this woman, what was her name? Charlie Javis or something like that, who was basically who had stolen a bunch of money and faked a number of users at to sell a company to Chase. And of course, she was a big time Zionist, backed by a lot of like very Likud heavy players. So yeah, I think we should be asking this question about like, has it been cheaper for these bankers and others just to pay off Bradley Edwards at all? Are they still kind of running a similar Ponzi scheme operation? Did the operation itself just move once Scott Rothstein went to jail? And is that kind of what's really animating a lot of this sort of stuff? I think these are very interesting questions in general. I know we're getting kind of late, and I know there's a lot of people on the East Coast probably about to go to sleep. But any other final thoughts? Anything anyone else wants to add? If there's anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question, we could do that real quick. I'm probably going to give this another 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, so we're going back to the CIA angle here. Where I know Epstein asked Edward Epstein to write some sort of biography of him, which would, I guess, be the sort of CIA authorized account of his life. Why? How come that never really happened? Aside from that, I guess, last chapter of Assume Nothing there.
Yeah,
Um,
we don't know. I mean, one is that we don't really know what the response was from Edward J. Epstein in 2015. It might have been that both men thought they were going to live a lot longer, right? So there's that aspect of it as well. So we don't really know, but it is a curious question about why it didn't happen. Um, and I think really what it probably was that Epstein was a kind of hip pocket asset, and I think some of it, I think Epstein would have been more helpful, say, in a Biden presidency or when the Democrats got back into power. I mean, he was a lifelong Democrat. Um, and so I think that could have been a possibility as well. That he might have been compelled to tell his story later on. I mean, he was still relatively young and in good shape in his 60s when he ultimately died. So, a physically fit guy, so maybe he thought he had more time before he could tell his story. And of course, there was this question. I think Edward J. Epstein, had a number of health issues around the time that Epstein ultimately died. So maybe they just never got around to it. It's always a possibility. What I find interesting is all of the Bill Barr stuff. Actually, not Bill Barr stuff. The Bill Burns stuff. Um, that's very curious to me. And I think you think about who was staying at his properties. He seems to have never had a position that was out of step with the CIA, which I find very curious. So you can go through all of his writings, and he's never opposing the CIA's position. Not ever.
which aspect of the CIA is this? I mean, it's
This
with
is the WASP.
Edward Epstein and Angleton before him,
Yeah, I
and
would say that this is the Anglo WASP. These are the Jews who are more WASP than the WASPs. That's sort of that group of them. And this is the kind of pre-Brennan, it's sort of like not the cowboy CIA. This is the kind of like Angleton, um, some of it's Safari Club, but not totally.
H.W.
Yeah,
Bush.
H.W. Bush would be one. So what's interesting is that he sort of, it seems ambivalent about H.W. Bush. Epstein does. He's sort of like finding his way if he's going to be a Democrat or a Republican, and ultimately throws behind Clinton and is sort of involved with the Clinton world. But they're sort of centrist Democrats. They're sort of like they're sort of liberal Zionists. I would argue that the political constituency that Epstein was a part of has more or less collapsed. Um, that it's there really isn't really a liberal Zionism anymore after what happened with Mamdani. So politically, it's much weaker, and obviously with Gaza and the genocide there. So I think there's sort of a lot of different angles there that we could pursue. But yeah, people point out the Roger Stone working with Scott Rothstein. Yeah, I mean Roger Stone is very tied into a lot of these Israeli networks and Russian networks as well. This is the kind of Likud network operating in Florida politics and operating in our country generally. What I do find interesting about Epstein, sort of another things too, like he has a lot of like interesting scientific interests. He's fascinated about genomics. You got a sense of that with the Jason Leopold and other Bloomberg reporters. They're writing on all of his books that he was buying and what was on his bookshelf. Um, sort of a curious guy, sort of well read in different ways. But yeah, he was sort of his time and place. I mean, friendly, of course, with with Larry Summers. His politics, are sort of not my politics. I would say he's much more like Zionisty or whatever. But it is curious, he's like building bridges between people, introducing people to each other. He's got Noam Chomsky, is one of Israel's largest critics. He's taking him to different events. Woody Allen is coming over. He's a sort of, I would say he's kind of like a New York Jew of a certain time frame, sort of secular, pro-American. There's no evidence in any of his writings that he was anti-American in any sense, which is curious. And sort of, you know, he was sort of dealing with what we might call the Russian deep state, but not its more mobbed up factions. So he's not in with the Chabad Lubavitch guys. He's sort of, he can go and call the inner circle in Putin's Russia, which is a fascinating kind of thing for a guy from Coney Island. Really raises a lot of fascinating questions there. My sense, for what it's worth, is that I was accused in the Hal Lambert lawsuit. Hal Lambert, of course, being backed by Elon Musk to sue me and DLA Piper. I was accused of being the next Epstein, or the new Epstein, as somebody who was plugged in with certain circles, moving money from across the world or whatever. That's of course kind of ridiculous. I think Epstein is a kind of finished figure. But I think we're going to see other figures in recent years kind of emerge, and I think maybe even a lot of these channels will be kind of done by the president himself. And you can kind of think about it in the context of like Qatar got attacked by Netanyahu, and of course, the Qataris have a lot of money invested in Trump properties and around Trump. So maybe what's going to happen in the future is that our presidents themselves will be the kind of money launderers, or like maybe we'll have a sort of sovereign wealth fund that will solve some of these issues and make it easier for us to transfer money, sort of independent of private interests or private empires. It's a sort of interesting question, like how that ultimately shakes out. Any other thoughts, friends? And I see some people in the audience. Any other questions? Feel free to message me privately. My DMs are open. Yeah, I didn't know that actually, Livid, that Stone had an office with Rothstein, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, Stone was always threatening people, threatening to blackmail people, and he's a rather repugnant figure. He and I were in a big fight back in the day. He claimed credit for various things I was involved in that helped Trump win. In retrospect, I probably should have just let him have the credit. Any other final thoughts, anybody? Well, I think that's enough for this evening. If anything else occurs to you, or this is a recorded space, I'll be hosting it up on my. I'll be taking the audio of it and putting it up on my Substack, which is Thoughts and Adventures. And maybe we'll do kind of a part 2 on Epstein. There's kind of a few things I wanted to kind of go into more detail on, but I think this is good for tonight. I'm off to Fort Worth. If any of you should find yourself in Texas over the next like 36 hours or so and want to get dinner or hang out, let me know. Otherwise, I'll be back in California after that. And I think I'm going to be back in DC semi-permanently in December, but I'm not sure yet. I have to sort of think about that and where I'm going to shake out and all that. So hope everybody has a good evening, and thanks for participating.